The whole question of women in history is an elusive one, as the most written about ladies tend to be queens, born or married into positions of power. Some, like the very English Queen Elizabeth I and Queen Victoria, built on their birthright with the power of their personalities to enjoy long and successful reigns, while others made the history books for all the wrong reasons. And it is to this latter category that the subject of our film, Marie Antoinette, the most famous Queen of France, belongs. It is true that she lived the life of luxury in the Palace of Versailles on the outskirts of France's capital, Paris, while her people quite literally starved. After all, the one thing that almost everyone knows is that Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake," when she was told that the French peasants had no bread, right? Well, look a little deeper and you'll find that things aren't exactly what they seemed. Today, royalty, politicians, and world leaders face a constant barrage of criticism from public opinion, fueled by the press, frequently as a result of the movers and the shakers behind the scenes working against them. There's nothing like positive or negative spin put out on a news story to inflame the masses, and surprising as it might sound, this was just as true in Marie Antoinette's day as it is in our own. There were some powerful people who this Austrian princess upset on her arrival as a young girl in France. And unfortunately, as you are about to discover, she paid the ultimate price for her childish errors, not only with her untimely death, but also with a tarnished reputation in the history books that would sully her name for all time. However, as we all try to learn the lessons of the past, historians are beginning to look more kindly on Marie Antoinette. And like every good story, there are definitely a number of different ways to interpret what happened. So for now, let's leave the spectacular beauty of the Palace of Versailles, the only world that Marie Antoinette ever really knew, and find the woman behind the femme fatale. Although known to the world as Marie Antoinette, her full name was actually Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna von Habsburg-Lothringen. And she was born at the Hofburg Imperial Palace in Vienna, Austria, on November the 2nd, 1755. Interestingly enough, the future Queen of France was born on the day that the French called Le Jour des Morts, the Day of the Dead. Indeed, it was a day filled with death for between 60 and 90,000 inhabitants of Lisbon, Portugal, who were killed in a violent earthquake, felt as far away as Scotland and the United Kingdom. And if that wasn't bad enough, the half-destroyed city was then ravaged by fire. It would seem that the young Marie Antoinette certainly picked quite a day to come into the world. The Hofburg Imperial Palace where she was born was the winter residence of the Habsburg dynasty, rulers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which included many countries from Central Europe, such as Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Slovenia, Bosnia, and Croatia. As of today, the Hofburg Imperial Palace serves as the official residence of the President of Austria. Marie Antoinette, as she became known when she later married, was the 15th of 16 children born to Austria's Empress Maria Theresa and the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I, and she enjoyed a very privileged upbringing in the beautiful city of Vienna. She was the youngest and the family's favorite daughter, destined from an early age to become the Queen of France. This was due to an arranged marriage that would benefit both France and Austria, while cementing a Franco-Austrian alliance between these two proud nations prone to fighting as often as they were at peace. Aside from Marie Antoinette's childhood being one of great luxury, due to the wealthy lifestyle the family enjoyed as rulers of Austria and surrounding countries, and great beauty due to the amazing palaces of Hofburg and Schönbrunn, and the unique environment of Vienna as a city, which is renowned to this day as a luxury holiday destination, there is little recorded of what she did or where she went. The most famous story told of Marie Antoinette's childhood concerns a young musical genius called Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who was born a mere 2 months after her. Mozart is certainly the most significant and possibly the most popular creator of European classical music, with recordings of his work selling more than any other composer in history. It's said that Mozart was called upon from his home in Salzburg to give a short musical concert for the Imperial family of Austria, because news of his prodigious talent had raced around the country. After the recital was over and the clapping had died down, the Empress Maria Theresa asked Mozart what he would like as a reward. She fully expected him to ask for something valuable from among the many treasures that littered the Hofburg Imperial Palace. But Mozart had been struck by the beauty of the Empress's daughter. Yes, you've guessed it, our very own Marie Antoinette. And rather than asking for something of monetary value, he asked for her hand in marriage instead. Allegedly, the whole assembly laughed at Mozart's audacity, but sadly on this occasion he didn't get what he asked for. Because of the signing of a peace treaty between France and Austria in 1748 to end over 150 years of fighting between the two countries, an agreement was reached between both royal families that King Louis XV of France would groom his son and heir to marry one of the Empress of Austria's daughters. In the following years, King Louis's son died of tuberculosis, and the Empress's daughters began dying of smallpox. By the time the families felt their children were ready to marry, the King of France had to name his grandson as the new heir. He was also called Louis, and as you may have already worked out, there was a long line of kings called Louis that sat on the French throne. Because of the death of 3 of her daughters, the Empress was required to put forward Marie Antoinette to marry the new Crown Prince of France, known as the Dauphin. The French court that young Marie would be marrying into was one of glamour, prosperity, decadence, and intrigue. And just a little background information on the royal family of France will prove really helpful. We'll start with the man who has gone down in history as the Sun King, after really putting France on the world map. Louis XIV was crowned king when he was only 4 years old in 1642, and was helped in his duties by Cardinal Mazarin, who became a father figure to him. When the cardinal died, Louis XIV was 22 years old, and he then became sole ruler of France. He reigned over his country for an unprecedented 72 years, and likened himself to Apollo, the Greek god of the sun, and hence became the Sun King. France steadily grew as a dominant force during his kingship to become one of the most powerful countries in the world and a leader in the arts. King Louis XIV's lasting legacy was Versailles. At the time, it was just a little village on the outskirts of Paris, France, where one of the king's hunting lodges was situated. Louis quickly transformed it into an opulent and lavish home for the French royal family. Ironically, it was jealousy that motivated him, as his superintendent of finances had built a chateau in collaboration with an architect, a landscape gardener, and an interior decorator. The dominant part of the complex was magnificent gardens, with an elevated platform in the middle of the woods, showcasing the incredibly imposing but elegant chateau. When the king saw the finished work, he wanted to build something exactly like it, but better. Eventually, Versailles grew into a fully fledged town, gathered around the central Palace of Versailles. King Louis XIV wanted to take charge of his government and have absolute power to rule over France, so he moved away from the diseased and overcrowded capital city of Paris and came to Versailles, making it his center of operations. First, the king improved the grounds with lavish gardens, sculptures, terraces, a lake, a zoo, and 1,500 water fountains. In 1668, he started work on the main chateau. 15 years later, he was able to move in. Nobody can say for sure how much it costs to build and maintain, but estimates have figured as high as hundreds of millions. However, in context, it was worth every last centime, as it became the seat of the French nobility, unified the warring factions of aristocrats around France, and was the new location of the royal court that Marie Antoinette would soon become a part of. If you think the exterior is opulent, then you haven't seen the interior. The Queen's bedroom, the state apartments, and the genuinely stunning Hall of Mirrors all vie for pride of place. The aforementioned hall holds 357 specially designed mirrors of an exceptional size for the 17th century, all linking with the windows on the walls and the arcades in the garden. It was the design and creation of the furniture, the architecture, and the lavish fittings of the Palace of Versailles that inspired and influenced many other countries' approaches to the look and design of buildings and furnishings. The arts and craftsmanship of France is here to see, with all its splendor and grandeur intact to this very day. 10,000 people lived at the Palace of Versailles, with the royal court revolving around the Sun King like the planets of the solar system. Every aspect of the king's life was conducted with pomp and ceremony, and this tradition would continue right through to Marie Antoinette's reign as the Queen of Louis XVI. The king was awakened each morning at 8 o'clock by his first valet, who slept on a folding bed in the king's room. Then, the first physician and the first surgeon entered the room to check the king's health. 15 minutes later, the Grand Chamberlain and other favored courtiers were admitted to watch the king dress. The valet always handed the royal shirt to the most important courtier in the room, who had the honor of handing it to the king. This was monarchy with a capital M. Moving at speed, something you need to do on a day trip to Versailles with so much to see. King Louis XV, who ascended to the throne in 1715, wouldn't be remembered for anything anywhere near so grand as this great palace. His main claim to fame would be two notorious mistresses. The first was Madame de Pompadour, and the second was Madame du Barry. Madame de Pompadour was a woman of wit, intelligence, and beauty. She played an active part in politics, architecture, royal duties, and palace life, as she was installed in her own apartments on the third floor of Versailles. Her commitment to persuading the king to commission new buildings can still be seen today, as she was directly responsible for the beautiful Place de la Concorde in the center of Paris. And she suggested the building of the École Militaire for the training of gentlemen soldiers, also located in Paris. In fact, if it hadn't been for École Militaire, then a certain Napoleon Bonaparte would never have become a student, and in turn a soldier, a general, and eventually the self-proclaimed Emperor of France. But more of him later. Madame de Pompadour died at the age of 42, yet she had already groomed her successor as the king's mistress, Madame du Barry. Unfortunately, this didn't help Louis XV's popularity, as he squandered immense sums of money on his decadent lifestyle. And by the time Marie Antoinette came to the royal court at Versailles, France had already fallen into an economic decline. Marie Antoinette was only 14 years old when she married the Dauphin in 1770. Louis himself was only a year older. Just before leaving for France, young Marie was given a crash course in French language, culture, and etiquette. She had been raised by a governess in Austria who had allowed her free rein to do whatever she wanted, which ultimately meant she spent more time playing than studying. Nevertheless, her mother's optimistic parting words suggested that she believed her daughter had a lot to offer. "Farewell, my dearest child. Do so much good to the French people that they can say that I have sent them an angel." The journey to France took weeks, but eventually Marie Antoinette reached the border with France on the 7th of May, 1770. All of the possessions that she'd brought with her from Austria, including the clothes she was wearing and her entourage of servants and friends, were to be left behind. The young girl was then forced to enter a specially erected grand pavilion alone, where she had to strip completely naked before stepping out the other side to be greeted by a group of messengers and courtiers from France. The newly adopted princess was then allowed to dress in French clothing and taken to a Thanksgiving Mass held in her honor. On the 16th of May, 1770, Marie Antoinette married Louis Auguste, the French Dauphin, in the Chapel Royal, just hours after she arrived at Versailles. As a wedding gift, Marie Antoinette was presented with an elaborate collection of jewelry that had been passed down from Dauphine to Dauphine. As a special gift, the king, her new father-in-law, gave Marie a fan encrusted with diamonds as his personal wedding present. After a sumptuous meal, the newlyweds were escorted to their bed to consummate the marriage. Opinion differs on why this didn't happen, quite literally for years. The popular consensus was that the prince was impotent, or possibly suffering from phimosis, which is a condition whereby the foreskin can't be stretched back, but it seems an unlikely explanation. New evidence contained in letters and reports have shown that he was actually rather too well endowed, and as he and his new bride were so young and hadn't even met before the wedding, naivety and shyness were probably the real culprits. But sadly, with no forthcoming male heir, the rumors began to circulate straight away that the marriage was a failure. Despite this, the French people took Marie Antoinette to their hearts during the first 4 years of her marriage. She was very kind to the poor, and on occasion dressed in simple peasant-style clothing, which endeared her to the population. However, when it came to Madame du Barry, the king's mistress, Marie Antoinette made an instant enemy. As a doted-upon princess, Marie believed it beneath her dignity to associate with the king's whore, and made the mistake of saying so, while refusing to speak to Madame du Barry. This resulted in the powerful older woman spreading vicious rumors throughout Versailles about Marie Antoinette, and although untrue, the Dauphine's reputation was forever damaged with the French people. Meanwhile, Marie settled into the daily routine of Versailles in full view of everyone. In a letter to her mother, she complained bitterly about her lack of privacy. "I put on my rouge and wash my hands in front of the whole world." Also, the court of Versailles was a lot stricter than she had been used to in Austria, where everything was more relaxed and not quite so formal. She was told off many times for yawning and giggling at royal ceremonies, and wandering off with only a few friends for company and no servants or guards to look after her. But the carefree existence of the girl bride and her young husband wasn't to last long. In 1774, just a few days after their 4th wedding anniversary, King Louis XV died from smallpox, and the prince and princess were transformed into a king and queen. The new king and queen of France got down on their knees and began to pray, as courtiers and servants rushed to their apartments to swear allegiance to their new royal couple. The first words that the youthful sovereign of France uttered were in an anxious prayer to the Almighty. "Dear God, guide and protect us. We are too young to reign." Although Louis and Marie had still to consummate their marriage, the new king pandered to his queen's expensive tastes, spending money the country could not afford. One of the first expenses that really turned the rising tide of civilian anger against the monarchy was the Petit Trianon, which sits in the gardens of Versailles. Originally built as a gift for Louis XV's mistress Madame du Pompadour, she had actually died before its completion, so consequently the delightful house passed to her successor, Madame du Barry. As you can see, the Petit Trianon itself is a beautiful thing to behold, being a perfect example of 18th century architecture, with its huge rectangular form and windows that make the house both imposing and inviting. Well, Marie Antoinette certainly thought so. Madame du Barry, still not on speaking terms with the new queen, was abruptly removed from her comfortable living quarters, and then no expense was spared as Marie Antoinette made the Petit Trianon her own. It was here that she could escape from the strict formal duties she struggled with, as the chateau became par ordre de la reine, by order of the queen. This meant that nobody could enter without gaining the queen's permission first, not even her husband, which caused resentment among those courtiers refused admittance. Romantic and idealistic, Queen Marie even built a temple of love in the park. But by this stage in the proceedings, the starving French thought they were being mocked by such extravagance, bleeding the nation dry. The coronation of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette took place at Rheims in northern France. Unfortunately, in 1774, there was a terrible bread shortage in France, especially in Rheims. But Marie Antoinette evidently had a wonderful day, which she wrote about in a letter to her mother. It is quite certain that in seeing the people who treat us so well despite their own misfortune, we are more obliged than ever to work hard for their happiness. The king seems to understand this truth. As for myself, I know that in my whole life, even if I live for 100 years, I shall never forget the day of the coronation. It was during the coronation that she was mistakenly attributed with the line, "If they have no bread, let them eat cake," when told of the starving people's plight. At the time, a brioche-type cake was made, which took less flour than bread, so her comment in retrospect was quite logical, but as "let them eat brioche" would have been a more accurate translation, it didn't have quite the same ring to it, and the young queen was forever misquoted. After the coronation, and not realizing what a state of financial ruin France was in, Marie Antoinette launched herself into a life of pleasure and careless extravagance. This included throwing and attending many masked balls in Paris, and also involved gambling, theatricals, and late-night walks in the park. Her little circle of friends included the king's frivolous younger brother, the Count of Artois, and handsome young courtiers such as the Duc de Ligne, Count Dion, and Axel Fersen. The young queen was a blonde beauty, with her official painter describing her as having a translucent colored complexion and a well-proportioned voluptuous figure. Her excessive and outrageous fashion style was copied all over the world, but individuality came at a price, fueling further the growing resentment that the French people felt for the privileged classes. The French public were tired of seeing and hearing about Marie Antoinette, as they really believed she was taunting them with her money and jewelry, while they were starving and dressed in rags. The last straw came when she built the Hameau de la Reine, or the Queen's Hamlet, in 1783. A hamlet is a small settlement that's too tiny or too unimportant to be considered a village. To describe in words this amazing place, which is one of the best-loved secrets of the Palace of Versailles, would be to do it an injustice. So take just a moment to view it for yourself. Any repairs and refurbishments to the model village today are guided by documents from the astonishingly complete archives of the Palace of Versailles. Since the time of Marie Antoinette, the plans, bills of material, invoices, receipts, and correspondence have been kept, which note virtually every construction, alteration, or demolition project undertaken. The names of the workmen involved are known, the wages paid, the dates, the costs of every item from nails and roof beams to door paint are all recorded. Marie Antoinette, always alert to fashionable trends, kept having the gardens redesigned, which ate up even more money that should not have been at her disposal to use. When this further extravagance became public knowledge, resentment against the monarchy increased, and Marie Antoinette became the symbol of everything the French working classes were learning to hate. There are 12 buildings that make up the Queen's Hamlet. 5 were reserved for the use of Marie Antoinette and her guests: the Queen's House, the Billiard Saloon, the Boudoir, the Mill, and the Dairy, where the Queen and her friends played at making butter. A tower called the Marlborough Tower was connected to the Dairy, and its vaguely medieval architecture is unusual for a Norman village. And despite the fact that the lower floor served as a fish house, it really was built just for show. Four buildings were dedicated to rural purposes, with the farm and its associated structures still being in use today. After 1787, when a second barn was constructed closer to the farm, the first in the main part of the village was converted into a ballroom for Marie Antoinette. Another building was used for housekeeping purposes, where meals were prepared when dinners were given at the Queen's house, while the 12th and last building served as the residence of the guardian of the gardens, Jean Barcy. Each building had its own little garden planted with flowers, cabbages, cauliflowers, and artichokes, enclosed by a low hedge or a fence. The staircases, galleries, and balconies were decorated with pots of flowers, including hyacinths, stocks, and geraniums. Plants climbed the walls of the buildings, and trellis work was used to shade some of the pathways. For Marie Antoinette, this place was an escape from the encroaching horror of the real world, where she created an all-too-perfect imaginary world of her own, where she could play at being a simple milkmaid. It's even been said that the porcelain bowls used in the dairy were cast by using Marie Antoinette's own ample breasts as a mold. Ironically, at this time when the Queen was accused of being at her most frivolous, with fabricated and scurrilous stories of wild liaisons with lovers of both sexes reaching the people of France, Marie was actually beginning to mature and develop as a woman. Then, the seemingly impossible happened. Marie Antoinette became pregnant after the royal marriage was finally consummated. Having eventually sorted out their difficulties, Marie Antoinette began to produce children in quick succession, beginning with a baby girl in December of 1778. Christened Marie Therese Charlotte, her mother had been forced to endure a public birth, something Marie Antoinette vowed she would never do again. Despite the noticeable disappointment of the royal court that the baby wasn't a boy, Marie Antoinette is recorded as saying, "A son would have belonged to the state, but you shall be mine and have all my care. You shall share my happiness and soften my sorrows." 3 more children would follow: Louis Joseph Xavier Francois in October 1781, Louis Charles in March 1785, and then Sophie Beatrix in July 1786. Motherhood fulfilled Marie Antoinette, and she became less boisterous, more sedate, and certainly more mature. She began to dress in simple gowns to allow the lower orders of society to copy her easily. She also put a stop to the court's extravagance with money. In the space of a couple of years, France's queen went from being a spoiled princess to a thoughtful young woman. Sadly, though, too much damage had already been done in the eyes of the French public, especially when it came to the extravagance of the Palace of Versailles and Marie's own little peasant's village. However, with her newfound maturity, who knows, Marie Antoinette might well eventually have turned public opinion back in her favor had it not been for the diamond necklace affair. One of the high-ranking French ministers of Louis XVI's court, Cardinal de Rohan, wanted to improve his social standing at Versailles. Nevertheless, he ill-advisedly began an affair with the Comtesse de la Motte, an impoverished aristocrat who proved to be nothing short of a con artist. She hired a woman to dress like Marie Antoinette, who met the cardinal in the dark gardens of Versailles one night. The false queen gave the cardinal a rose and hurried away, leaving the cardinal under the illusion that he had met the Queen of France. Next, the fake comtesse told the cardinal that the queen, Marie Antoinette no less, wanted him to purchase a very expensive diamond necklace on her behalf. Obediently, the cardinal obtained the necklace and gave it to Comtesse de la Motte, expecting the queen to pay for it. Of course, Marie Antoinette never saw the necklace. The Comtesse de la Motte gave the diamonds to her husband, who took them to London and sold them. When the jewelers demanded payment, the diamond necklace affair became public. The cardinal and the comtesse were quickly arrested. The cardinal was tried and acquitted, while the Comtesse de la Motte was imprisoned, publicly flogged, and branded. Eventually, she escaped to London, where she spread malicious rumors about Marie Antoinette. She pretended that the Queen of France had known all about the plot, and she also made accusations in public about a secret romantic rendezvous that she'd had with Marie Antoinette. As is usual with rumors, regardless of whether they're true or not, the stories began to stick, and they were exploited by Marie's enemies to help damn her character still further in the eyes of the French people. Ironically, many people believe that this was the turning point between talk of revolution and an actual will among the people of France to overthrow the monarchy, setting the wheels of revolution in motion. The revolutionaries believed that by getting rid of the old order headed by the king and queen, they could rule France with a people's republic. As mentioned previously, the financial situation of France had been deteriorating alarmingly since the death of the Sun King Louis XIV, and Louis XV, with his extravagant lifestyle, had made matters worse rather than better. Consequently, Louis XVI had inherited a poisoned chalice, and the young man had little natural ability and certainly no training to equip him for such a great task. Even a modern-day economist would have struggled to restore the fortunes of France. So a young man who had experienced little of life beyond the privileged walls of Versailles stood no chance. This was France's first revolution, and the country would switch back and forth between a people's republic and an empire state, before returning to a monarchy again for the next 75 years. However, despite what certain accounts of history may imply, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were not totally responsible for what happened. There is an expression that says, if a person is not part of the solution, they are part of the problem, and this probably best sums up the king and queen situation, because there were many causes of the French Revolution. For a start, the economy of France was tied up in a huge national debt that could not be cleared, even by heavy taxation of the citizens. Secondly, there had been a revolution in America, which had resulted in independence for the people, which may well have inspired the people of France to try the same thing. Thirdly, the indolence of the landed gentry, namely the aristocrats born into wealth and social position, upset the new professional classes born out of the Industrial Revolution, who promoted the ethic of a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. Also, of course, the food situation in France was appalling in the months leading up to the revolution, and, as we already know, forced a bread shortage, with that which was available being sold at ridiculously high prices. People were starving, and throughout history, this predicament has always resulted in normally law-abiding citizens taking drastic action. Combined with these factors, the diamond necklace affair, which the revolutionaries used to their full advantage, and the royal family of France was doomed. Also, on a more personal level, Marie Antoinette faced the horror of the deaths of two of her children through illness. Losing her youngest daughter Sophie and the heir to the French throne Louis Joseph proved to be equally as devastating as what she was about to face on a political level. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted on the streets of Paris, with much of the revolutionaries' fury focused on Marie Antoinette. On October the 5th, a mob of Parisian women marched on Versailles, shouting for the Queen's blood. Some members of the mob were actually men in disguise, working on the theory that royal troops were less likely to fire upon women. When the mob appeared outside the Palace of Versailles, Marie Antoinette bravely stepped out onto the balcony and faced them alone. The Queen did nothing more than bow her head and curtsy. The action of forgiveness and the courage of her convictions made all the difference. The mob began chanting "Vive la Reine," which means "Long live the Queen," and the royal family's lives were spared, but it was only a postponement of the inevitable. Before very long, the king, the queen, and their two surviving children were kept virtual prisoners in Paris, at the rundown Tuileries Palace that hadn't been in use since the time of King Louis XIV. Instead of fleeing as quickly as they could into permanent exile, they spent their time trying to negotiate with foreign powers to help them stabilize France and regain control. Marie Antoinette was most worried about her young son Louis Charles, who was now the heir to the throne, and when no help was forthcoming, they decided to quickly escape over the border into Marie Antoinette's homeland, Austria. However, they were too late. Revolution was everywhere, and they were caught when a shopkeeper recognized them and raised the alarm. The depleted royal family was sent back to Paris, where the mob was baying for their blood. King Louis XVI was forced to accept the new regime, but Marie Antoinette was made of sterner stuff, and she attempted to declare war on Austria in 1792, so that Austria would retaliate and invade France. However, in doing so, she was actually committing treason, a fact that the revolutionaries would later use against her. In August 1792, a large group of Parisian citizens arrested the royal family on charges of treason and locked them away. The following year, King Louis XVI was executed, having his head chopped off by guillotine. Although the guillotine's fame dates from its extensive use during the Reign of Terror of the French Revolution, the first guillotine-like instrument was used as early as 1307. The machine was named after Dr. Louis Guillotine, who proposed that such a machine be used for official executions, because it was supposedly a quick and painless form of capital punishment. Previously, the form of execution depended in part on a person's social class. A nobleman might merit a quick blow from a well-swung axe. But if you were a commoner, you might suffer the torture of being hung, drawn, and quartered, stoned, or even burned alive. In spite of its efficiency, an execution by guillotine would still have been a sickening spectacle in a fair-minded society. When the head was severed, blood poured from the body as the heart continued to pump, and the crowds that gathered to see the mass executions of the French Revolution developed a real bloodlust. As the aristocrats were lined up to face their gruesome end, we can only imagine the terror they felt. The horror of the situation for Marie Antoinette must have been unbearable. Her husband was dead, and her children were taken from her to face the revolutionaries without even the protection of their mother. The deposed, widowed queen was paraded on a wooden cart for all to see. Her hair had turned prematurely white. She had lost weight from lack of food and internal bleeding, and she looked much older than her 37 years. She sat bolt upright and proud with her hands tied behind her back as she faced the constant spitting, booing, and hissing of the revolutionaries. Some would say that Marie Antoinette had done nothing wrong. She had been a very young queen, inexperienced in the ways of the monarchy, who had grown too late into a mature and more sensible woman. Her will to live had probably left her when the children were snatched and her husband executed. With dignity, she climbed the steps to the guillotine. The priest, who stood at the top, held her arm and whispered, "This is the moment, madame, to arm yourself with courage." Marie Antoinette, it said, turned incredibly slowly and serenely and looked him straight in the eyes. She replied clearly and deliberately, "Courage. The moment when my troubles are going to end is not the moment when my courage is going to fail me." Her last words were to her executioner when she stumbled over his foot near the guillotine's block. "Monsieur," she said, "I ask your pardon. I did not do it on purpose." This last statement could equally well be attributed to her life as the Queen of France. She hadn't asked to be, possibly hadn't even wanted to be queen. She had simply done her duty as demanded, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, having become an unwitting symbol of hate for the French revolutionaries. From Versailles to the scaffold was a short journey in distance, but the two locations were 1,000,000 miles apart for Marie Antoinette. She faced the guillotine with great dignity, while the revolutionaries cheered as Marie's head was shown to the crowd, and her body was thrown into an unmarked grave. Years later, Napoleon, by then Emperor of France, had the bodies of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette found and finally laid to rest with due honor in the peace and tranquility of the royal crypt at St. Denis Basilica to the north of Paris, which is well worth taking time out to visit on any Parisian tour. As a bizarre footnote, Marie Antoinette's surviving son, Louis Charles, who was separated from her when in captivity, has instigated much speculation. He was proclaimed King Louis XVII of France by his relations who had fled France, but the little boy was, of course, never able to rule. History records that he died of tuberculosis when he was 10 years old, alone in his prison cell, sometime after his parents had been executed. During the autopsy to determine the cause of his death, his heart was smuggled out of the prison, following the long tradition of preserving the hearts of royalty by the examining physician Philippe Jean Pelletan, and that is what this glass jar in the Basilica St. Denis is purported to contain. Of course, rumors were then rife that the body that was buried in a mass grave was not that of Louis Charles at all, and that he had been smuggled out of prison alive, with his heart still intact inside his body. When the French monarchy was restored in 1814, literally hundreds of people came forward claiming to be the lost prince. Even today, people still claim to know or be descended from Louis Charles. So perhaps despite the best efforts of the French revolutionaries, Marie Antoinette's spirit lives on after all. And so we've reached journey's end at Marie Antoinette's peaceful final resting place, marked by a simple slab, identical to her husband's, who lies next to her. After all the pomp and circumstances of the Palace of Versailles, it's only right and proper that this much maligned lady of French history has been treated with due respect. Marie Antoinette was no angel, despite what her mother had hoped for when she sent her lovely daughter to the French court. There is much she can be criticized for in her youth, but who among us can honestly say we would have acted differently? Walk through the state apartments of Versailles, wonder at the opulence of Marie Antoinette's bedroom, and then discover the magic of the Petit Trianon and her peasant village, and ask yourself whether you would have been able to resist such charming surroundings. Because of her upbringing, Marie Antoinette simply accepted these luxuries as her birthright, without a thought of what it cost. If you look at the great women of history, we love best the ones that are flawed. But those that have lived the longest, like Queen Elizabeth I and Queen Victoria, have the best reputations for a very good reason. Any wild moments and selfish actions in youth are corrected in maturity, about the only luxury Marie Antoinette never got the chance to enjoy. Consequently, Marie Antoinette will forever be remembered as a beautiful young girl who quickly learned to live life to excess from those around her at the French court of Versailles. Had she been allowed to grow old gracefully with the love of a good husband and her children to teach her the wisdom she lacked, this story would undoubtedly have had a much happier ending. But such is the nature of history. Speculation about what might have been is often more satisfactory than what actually happened. In Marie Antoinette's case, it's tempting to use the benefit of hindsight to judge her. But as we leave this beautiful village that she built here in the grounds of Versailles, we would do better to try and understand the girl that she was, hankering after the simple life, and the woman she might just have become, had fate smiled more kindly.